I'm Ashley Hyman. I'm the VP of Customer Success here at Drata, and I want to thank you guys for joining us today for our third installment of Ask an Auditor. It's been very popular, so we plan to continue to hold these, and I thank you guys for attending and showing interest. We know you've really enjoyed it thus far, but we're going to change it up this time. We have invited a special guest to join us alongside Troy. So joining us today is Tim Wolfgang. He's the manager of Risk Advisory Services for Schneider Downs. Tim has been a part of Schneider Downs Risk Advisory Service practice since 2015. He brings a ton of experience and IT knowledge to his clients and really takes a hands-on approach in working with them. He's worked on over 100 SOC reports during his time at Schneider Downs and currently focuses on SOC for cloud-hosted systems. We have lots of customers that they work with Schneider Downs and have had tons of positive things to say about Tim. So we wanted to welcome him to our Ask an Auditor. So feel free to say hi, Tim.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for having me. I've had the privilege of working with Troy and Ashley for over a year now with Drata, and I love it, and I really love educating people on it. So very happy to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Many of you are probably familiar with Troy Fine, but those not familiar, Troy advises our customers on building sound cybersecurity risk management programs while also meeting security and compliance requirements. Before Drata, he served as a senior manager of IT risk advisory services at Schneider Downs. So thanks for joining us again, Troy.
No problem, man. Tim's intro, yours was a lot better than mine. I think we need to improve mine next time.
We'll go back to the drawing board.
They definitely spent more time on yours, Tim.
Troy learned everything he knows from me.
There we go. The truth comes out. The truth comes out. Next LinkedIn
post webinar over.
Will be by Tim. All right. All right. Well, like our last session, we're going to try and answer as many of your questions as possible. So to start, I'll ask Troy and Tim one question each, and then for the remaining questions, we'll give them both a chance to answer and give their opinions. I'm hoping for some steamy debates here. That said, if you have a question during the session, drop it in the Q&A below or the chat. Either one, we'll be sure to grab it, but Q&A would be the primary place. If there's time remaining at the end of the session, we'll choose additional questions to answer as well. And then any that we don't get through will get added to future Ask an Auditor sessions. So the first question is for Troy. What things should companies be aware of for ISO 27002 changes, and how will that impact ISO 27001 certification processes?
Yeah, my favorite subject. Let's start off with ISO. Yeah, so just before I get into the changes, it's a good reminder to know that when you're doing a certification audit for ISO 27001, the certification standard is actually 27001, and 27002 is the deep dive into the Annex A controls, like the implementation guidance, right? So what they updated in February 2022 was the new version of the 27002 standard. 27001 is still going to be the certification standard that organizations are getting audited against and getting certified against, but there's going to be some changes that they have to be aware of for 27002. Right now, the transition period is still being determined. 27002 was released in February of 2022, but they now have to go modify ISO 27001 and reference the new 27002 standard. I'm thinking that it's likely going to be 18 months to 2 years transition period for organizations to comply with the new 27001 standard when they start referencing the new 27002 standard, but that's still going to be determined in the next few months. But for now, it's good to be aware of just the high level changes. So one, they did categorize the controls into 4 categories now. I think it used to be, Tim probably knows better than me, I don't know, 14 or 15 before, but now it's categorized into 4: organizational, people, physical, and technological. So those controls are going to be categorized into that. And then they also added this concept of attributes in 27002. So each control has four attributes tied to it, or 5 attributes. One being control type. So is it a detective control, corrective control, preventative control? There's information security properties. So does it impact the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the data? There are cybersecurity concepts that tie to the control. So is it a control for identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, or recovering, which is very similar to the NIST cybersecurity framework, if you're familiar with that. And then they have operational capabilities, which is very similar to the old security, to the old domains that I would call. So if it's a governance control, it would be under the governance operational capability. If it's a physical security control, it'll be under the physical security operational capability. And then the last one is security domains. These are just high-level domains, governance and ecosystem, risk management, IT security administration, and defense. So there's high-level information security domains that they also tied to these. Overall, they reduced the number of controls to 93. There's 11 new controls, 24 controls were merged together, and 58 of them were actually revised from the old version of 27,002. So the biggest lift, in my opinion, is not necessarily implementing those 11 new controls. It's mostly a formatting thing for a lot of the certification bodies. I don't think it'll actually take that long to meet the new requirements of 27,002. But they are probably going to give you 18 to 24 months to probably get those in place. So that's the good news. And that's really at a high level, unless Tim, you had anything to add there from those changes.
I think that, I mean, it's good because I think you asked how many domains there are. I don't know because I don't do a lot of ISO, but I think it's good that they've kind of categorized it into 4 different areas, like operational, because then it's easier for organizations to figure out who's going to be responsible for those kind of things. At the end of the day, or kind of assign responsibility. So that's kind of just my take on it. But I think it's a good update.
Awesome. Okay, well, we'll move on to our next question. This one is for Tim. From an auditor's perspective, why is it important for a compliance automation tool to have processing integrity in its SOC 2 report? So meaning the tool itself has their SOC 2, as they should. Why is processing integrity integral for that report?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, processing integrity is an interesting area within SOC 2 because it's one where, as an auditor, you have to spend more time than any other area by far defining like what the controls would be within that domain. Processing integrity, for those that aren't familiar, deals with how organizations ensure that data output by their systems is complete and accurate. And we end up doing a lot with systems that kind of process customer financial transactions. So for example, like a payroll provider, you want to make sure that the pay that you're giving your employees is accurate based on the inputs that you put in. So processing integrity is primarily, we need to cover how the organization specifies the data inputs and the data outputs. So do you have documentation of what's going to come in, what's going to come out, kind of any transformations that occur, how you ensure the completeness and accuracy of what goes in, ensure the completeness, accuracy of the processing, ensure completeness and accuracy of what's come out of the system, and then how do you protect that data through each of those steps to prevent unauthorized modifications. So I mentioned financial systems. With a compliance automation tool like Drata, processing integrity is very important because they're expecting auditors, their customers, auditors, to use the data output by Drata in the audit. Our standards require that we use information in our SOC 2 audits or ISO audits or whatever that is complete and accurate and system generated. So traditionally, I would have go into somebody's AWS environment and say, give me a screenshot of the users or the password settings. What allows me to rely on Drata for the audits is that they, within their SOC 2, have had an auditor go in and do the processing integrity, where that auditor will look at what information Drata is pulling in, how it's kind of processing that data, and then whether it's accurate coming out. So for example, like the monitoring controls, You know, if Drata is saying all employees have multi-factor authentication, you know, all right, for that specific test, what's being pulled in? You know, what is the source of that data? Is it, you know, your Google Workspace account? You know, is it, you know, is it pulling in that information? And then is it reading that information correctly? So, you know, if all users have multi-factor authentication set up, does Drata say the test passed? If Drata, you know, says a test fails, is that because one user doesn't have multi-factor authentication set up? And then how does it output that data to the auditor or to the end user to show that it's correct? So processing integrity is, you know, very key, because we're essentially saying we can skip the system generated evidence and rely on what Drata is telling us, because they have had somebody independently audit their system to show it's, you know, complete and accurate at the end of the day. So, you know, that's kind of my take on it.
That makes total sense. I mean, and just for the audience, when Drata is working with new auditors or auditors that haven't used the system before, they will often want to see our SOC 2 report, which totally makes sense. And so we'll provide it. They'll be able to review what we were tested on. And then, like Tim said, that can give them more comfort over what the system is providing to them. So I know that was really important for our leadership team that we include that in our SOC 2. So totally makes sense. Kind of off the cuff, what would you say, or what percentage of your clients, Tim, include processing integrity in their audits? Is it fairly rare?
It's pretty rare. I can probably count on one hand how many SOC 2s I do with processing integrity.
Got it. So it's not as necessary for maybe other companies.
No, I would say it's something that, yeah, it's going to be something that gets requested from you. Don't feel like you need to do it. You know, I always say there's no bonus points for doing extra compliance, you know, at the end of the day.
I love it. Okay.
I would add though, it is, I think processing integrity is becoming more important for the automation tools. You know, the AICPA called it out in their frequently asked questions, or their guidance document. You know, it's not authoritative, but it's guidance. So they're pushing CPA firms to look at those reports, look at processing integrity, understand the controls that the auditor tested on the compliance automation platform, to say like, hey, you know, these platforms are performing these types of tests. Did the auditor test the test, so to speak, to make sure that the test is performing as it's supposed to, right? So if it says multi-factors turned on, can an auditor rely on that? Because an auditor during the processing integrity testing said, go show me your lab environment, turn off multi-factor authentication, and show me that the platform, when you run your test, shows that these users don't have it turned on. So like, I think the AICPA is pushing auditors to dig a little deeper in those areas.
I quick question. Does anybody like ever ask you, like, you know, at Drata, or like just in general, like for like kind of details of like what actually went into the auditor test? Because I know lots of times the SOC report, like that section 4, the control and description of the test, are somewhat generic. And, you know, I'm just curious, like if there's any, you know, people are asking you guys about like the sample sizes that went into it, or things like that to get additional details. I mean,
you mean for our report?
Yeah. I mean,
we haven't been asked those specific questions yet, but
I mean, I tell people, like, if you like are, you know, kind of unsure about something in the SOC report, you can always reach out to your customer and, you know, whoever gave you that SOC report, and ask for like additional details. I don't think it would hurt to ask. I mean, we've encouraged people to do that when, you know, the specifics are a little bit unclear.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Absolutely. Well, we're a couple minutes ahead, so I'm going to bring in this question that came in through the chat, because it's definitely on topic. You know, Tom mentioned security is required, obviously, processing integrity is rarely included. What about the other trust service criteria? Which, you know, are you seeing most common? What would you recommend to a company? Maybe Tim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, you know, security, and security, confidentiality, availability are the 2 types of reports that we do the most of. I'd say those make up the bulk of it. And so I think that's just because they make sense. I mean, a lot of times confidentiality is meant to address if you're receiving sensitive information from your customers. So, Drata is collecting sensitive information. Confidentiality kind of covers off, is that data encrypted? Do you have a policy to classify that data and store it in only approved locations? Do you make sure that that data gets disposed of whenever you don't need it anymore? And I think that makes a lot of sense, because most organizations that are getting SOC 2 are dealing with data that has some sort of sensitivity. And then with, a lot of like SaaS platforms, a lot of systems in general, they need to be available to end users. So availability makes a lot of sense too. So it said security is great. I say there's nothing wrong with doing just security, but if you have like service level agreement requirements, uptime requirements, you want to put availability in your SOC 2. And if you're dealing with, sensitive data, or even data that's mildly sensitive, and confidentiality makes sense. I told you, like I said, I think as a firm, we do like 160, 170 SOC reports a year. We probably do processing integrity in 10 of those. Privacy is the 5th category. We don't do much privacy. I think maybe 15 reports or 20 reports a year, but similar to processing integrity, that area has been growing a lot. And I think that's just due to the proliferation of the different privacy regs that have come out in the past few years, between GDPR, CCPA, a lot of companies working with universities have to show, have that kind of like FERPA compliance requirements. So we're seeing a lot of increase in privacy, because they're kind of using that as a vehicle to communicate their internal privacy practices. So that's growing as well. But yeah, privacy and processing integrity are very far below the security, availability, confidentiality trifecta.
Awesome. Super helpful. Tom, hopefully that helped you as well. I have one that I'd like both of your input on, kind of shifting gears to PCI. So what are some things companies should be aware of with the updates to PCI version 4? From a PCI qualified auditor perspective, what changes do you need to make now, and how should we as customers plan?
I'll take the overview, and then I'll give you the hard question, Tim, for how to prepare. So, Tim's that's the skill I picked up as a manager. I can't help it. In March 2022, as most of you probably have seen, version 4.0 was released by PCI, and it was it's a pretty significant change. Just like if you were just opening up the documents for PCI, before I get into the details, I think before it was like 150 pages or something around there. So if you open up the new report on compliance for version 4.0, it's over 400 pages. Now, there's a reason why it is, but just looking at it just from a page number perspective, you can actually see that there's got to be significant changes. But the good news is they're giving you about a 2-year transition period, right? So PCI version 3.21 or 3.2.1 is actually going to be retired on March 31st, 2024. So that means that you can still do PCI version 3.2.1 up until March 31st, 2024. After March 31st, 2024, you must, if you're going to undergo a PCI assessment with a QSA, you're going to have to use version 4.0. And out of those, for version 4.0, there's actually 64 new requirements. About 50 of them are new requirements that they're calling best practices. And I think about 13 of them are new requirements that have to be implemented immediately if you were to start using version 4.0. The 51 or about 50 new best practices, they're actually giving you till March 31st, 2025 to implement those. So just to kind of recap there, on March 31st, 2024, you have to start using version 4.0. But 50 of those requirements, you don't have to have implemented until March 31st, 2025. So hopefully that makes sense for everybody listening. Most of the new requirements that are effective immediately, as I look through it, are actually around just documenting your roles and responsibilities for the specific requirements. There's a few that are related to the third-party service providers, but most of them that are immediate I think are fairly easy lifts, which is why they made them immediate. The thing to be aware of is though they did make a lot of modifications and clarifications to existing requirements that are already in place for 321. So you will have to review those existing requirements still and understand those new modifications. PCI, Tim could probably get into this a little bit more, but they actually haven't started training QSAs yet on version 4.0. I think that's supposed to start May, June timeframe. So a QSA can actually perform an assessment against version 4.0 if they wanted to, and if you wanted them to, but they can't actually issue an attestation of compliance or a report on compliance until they complete that training. So I'm guessing earliest that somebody could get one on 4.0 will probably be August of 2022, if I had to guess. SAQs have not been updated yet from what I checked right before this webinar just to make sure, and they have not been published yet to the Security Council website. And then one other change that Tim might get into a little more, they have these new approaches to testing, one being a customized approach and one being a defined approach. The defined approach is just as you would have done in 321. You implement the control as it's stated, you follow the requirement, and you're good to go. But the customized approach is a little different. It's actually allowing entities to meet a requirement without following the letter of the law of the requirement. So it's allowing you kind of to an alternative method for meeting a requirement. If you have different different tech stack or different architecture, but you have to get the QSA to kind of agree to that, and you have to document it a certain way. That's why there's over 400 pages, because each requirement now the QSA has to fill out, is it the customized approach or is it the defined approach? So it adds a lot to the actual report on compliance. So I think unlike ISO 27002 changes, I think this one is a pretty significant lift, and that's why they're actually giving 2 to 3 year transition depending on the type of controls. But Tim, curious what your thoughts are as a QSA and what you think the most, what the biggest changes might be.
Did you leave anything for me to talk about?
I can't help it, man.
Yeah. So yeah, like Troy was saying, the only things that you need to do immediately if you want to move to 4.0 are document roles and responsibilities for meeting each of kind of the PCI requirement areas. And then also document your scope. So that's, systems where, cardholder data is stored, processes, transmitted, and then, kind of review and update that scope annually. So, if you're already like PCI kind of compliant, you should have like a data flow diagram. And it's, kind of, I guess, bulking up that documentation to document, that you've reviewed it and that, you've kind of checked for any changes, maybe check for cardholder data in other locations. Those are the only things that are available or kind of required immediately. And to your point, like our training's coming due for the year, and we're not sure if it's going to be the 3.21 training again or the 4.0 training yet. If it is the 3.21 training, then we'll have to do another round of training for 4.0. So it's kind of like up in the air, like when that'll be available to us. We're not quite sure, but it should be within the next few months. And as far as like the technical requirements that have changed, a few I wanted to highlight were, one, like password policy changes. I know like a lot of people now have heard about the new NIST guidance that says longer passwords, lower rotation, and then look to implement, password blacklists or banned lists, where you like disallow the use of certain common words and passwords. So the new 4.0 kind of takes that into consideration and requires longer passwords be used, at least 12 characters. It also, specifies that multi-factor authentication is required for any access to cardholder data environments, among other things. Another item that I wanted to highlight from a technical controls perspective is log monitoring, where the old 3.2.1 guidance just said that logs needed to be reviewed daily. Now it says you need to use like an automated tool to assist with, kind of reviewing those logs. So feeding, whenever we talk about logs, those are usually from like your user authentication systems, network logs, so like firewall logs or like NetFlow logs, and feeding them into like an automated tool like a SIM or like a Splunk or something, and using kind of correlating that data together to generate alerts or other kind of targeted information to review. But it's required to use like an automated system rather than just pulling a report of your logs and reading through them. So that's going to be a requirement that people are going to need to put something like that in place if you don't have it already. So yeah, I think what we'll probably see is a lot of 3-2-1 assessments, and then auditors kind of bringing up, or QSAs bringing up, hey, here's the new 4.0 requirements. Let's start thinking about the changes and what you need to do over the next 2 to 3 years to implement it. So yeah, it's nice that you have that runway, and I makes sense. You can't kind of expect people just to be ready for it right away.
Right. We're going to try to squeeze one last question in there. You guys really liked the PCI one.
I warned you.
One of our listeners would like to know, what are some key things that companies with successful type 1 audits may struggle with when it comes to their SOC 2 type 2? Tim, we'll let you finish us off with this one.
I think it's sustaining controls. That's what makes the SOC 2 type 2 like much more robust. It's not just saying you can do something once, but that you can repeat it over time, so that you can run your vulnerability scans monthly or quarterly. It's not just saying, oh, the auditor's here for a type 1, let me go run a scan and see what happens. It's making sure that that schedule is occurring and that you're running it, that your security compliance or security steering committee is meeting on that quarterly basis and kind of keeping things going. So it's kind of important to set up a schedule of events that recur over that 6-month or 12-month period for the type 2 and kind of adhere to it. Because, if we come asking for evidence that for X month you ran a vulnerability scan and you don't have it, like it's not like something you can get out of. So I think, thinking about what's going to reoccur and sticking to that.
Yeah, that's a good. I think you nailed it with the sustaining of controls. And you do a type 1, that's great, but the type 2 is going to cover that period of time, 6 to 12 months. And when an auditor comes in, if in month 1 of the type 2 audit period you had controls failing, well, there's a potential for a failure. Whereas in a type 1, you really only need it the day of, right? You could actually have been failing the day before and still get issued an audit report, no exceptions noted, and no one knows the difference. But a type 2 is completely different because it's covering that period of time. So that is a very important aspect to focus on. And I think too, in a type 1, you can get away with probably just showing policies a lot to evidence controls. Whereas when you get to that operational effectiveness in a type 2, you actually have to show more than just the policy. You have to show like the operating effectiveness of that control with supporting evidence of the control, either a configuration or the actual like taking samples from a population of new hires over a period of time and showing security training, background checks, things of that nature. So there's definitely more room for error in a type 2. And I think depending on, it's very subjective for the auditor that you're working with. Some in a type 1 will kind of do a better job of preparing you, so to speak, for that type 2 and understanding like, hey, we did this in a type 1, but just so you're aware, in a type 2, we're going to need to dig a little deeper. And here's some things we might look at where, if you're just have an auditor that just kind of looked at policies and just really didn't prepare you well, you could be caught off guard. So I think it's an important question to ask your auditor. That question I asked you, just ask me and Tim, ask your auditor when you do a type 1, like, what are the biggest differences for a type 2 that could throw me off or could catch me off guard? I
mean, I'll kind of put this out there, because I know we're almost out of time. Ask for the type 2 request list so you know what you'll need to provide. Like, have yours say to your auditor, what are you going to ask me for the type 2? Can you show me that request list? Start, looking through it if they don't review it with you and say, do I have this evidence, or do I have, they're gonna ask for a sample of this. Well, can I prove for every time this happened that it occurred? So yeah, ask for that request list. I think it's a good practice.
Yep. Don't be shy with your auditor.
Absolutely. And I think that highlights a key point we see on the customer success side of Drata every day, the importance of selecting an auditor you're comfortable with and can talk to and have a conversation with. So we're always happy to help direct you there. And at the same time, when you do get that request list from your auditor, if you're a Drata customer, share it with your CSM, who can help you to dig a little deeper. They'll probably pull Troy in or one of our other compliance friends to support there. But we're always here to help